How hardened is your area to an SHTF event in the future? How resilient would your county or your community be during a disaster scenario? That's a question that the US Census Bureau sought out to answer back in the summer of 2020. So in this video, we're going to discuss the data that they compiled and how it applies to your situation. Hey everybody, it's Magic Prepper, and today we're talking about whether or not your area is hardened to an SHTF event in the future, and whether or not your community or your county would be resilient to a disaster scenario. That is something that the US Census Bureau tried to answer by putting together an interactive data tool known as the Community Resilience Estimates tool. And that's available for the public to easily access to try to make decisions on whether or not you're in a high-risk area. And that is something that we can definitely benefit from when it comes to planning for our preparedness. Now, if you're worried about if you're in a high-risk area or not, and you're worried about disaster scenarios happening in the future, then hit the subscribe button below, because hopefully these conversations will help motivate you and also give you information that will help you plan better for any future crisis, okay? Now, this data tool analyzes the resiliency of counties around the country and bases whether or not they'd be able to endure, respond, or recover to an emergency scenario on risk factors. And the risk factors are based on populations of the community having either 0, 1 to 2, or 3 or more risk factors. And the percentage of that population is then factored into whether or not that county is actually low risk, moderate risk, or high risk in the sense of their ability to deal with an emergency. So the risk factors include things like income to poverty ratio, single or zero caregiver households, crowding, communication barriers, households without full-time employment, disabilities, no health insurance, age 65 and up, no vehicle access, and no broadband internet access. Those are some of the risk factors that are being put together in this data tool in order to say whether or not a community can easily bounce back after a disaster. Now, basically at the end of the day, everywhere has populations with these risk factors, but some populations have a higher percentage of people with no risk factors versus lower percentages of people with 3 or more risk factors. One thing to consider though when utilizing this tool and trying to figure out things about your area or maybe an area you might relocate to is to understand that even though some maybe rural counties here in North Dakota might look like they're very high risk, that's also only being applied to the fact that they have maybe, 40,000 people? Whereas if you look at places like Sacramento County in California, it's considered low risk because a big percentage of the population doesn't have as many risk factors. However, even though that's the case, the percentage of the population that has 3 or more risk factors is still a huge amount of people in comparison to the population of this North Dakota county where barely anybody lives there anyway. So that is something for you to consider because yes, it might seem like Sacramento County would be a better option than maybe some of these smaller, more rural environments. However, now you're talking about larger numbers being applied to these percentages, and that's still going to be a problem. So understand that you really need to be looking at the percentages of people with the risk factors more so than just only the color coordinated aspect of this interactive tool that tells you this is a nice place to be in the sense of resiliency, because I still advocate for you to not be in a major metropolitan area. Now, other data that we found out using this tool and that was provided to us by the US Census Bureau is that basically geographically, rural counties are likely to be at high risk. 30% of rural counties around the United States are considered high risk. And for the reasons I just told you in many ways. Because yes, you're gonna have a lot of low income in rural areas. You're gonna have a lot of, things like age 65 and up in that sense. And you're also gonna have things like, I guess you would say, lack of the ability to have full-time employment and things of that nature. Of course, you're gonna see that in rural environments more often. But the population matters there. So the other thing that's also included in their information is that socio-demographically, things change based on who lives in those areas too. So basically, any area that had a high portion of low-income families, a greater amount of single mothers, a majority Black and Hispanic population, or a lot of senior citizens generally fell into high-risk categories as well. So those are other things to consider when it comes to using this tool and understanding your local area, okay? Now the other thing to also understand is that the Department of Health and Human Services work jointly on this project actually offers ways that you can become more resilient as an individual as well as more resilient as a community. And I thought that this was interesting as well because some of the things that they advocate for were harder to accomplish during the crisis that they tried to use to make all these plans necessary. So I thought that was very interesting. But if you want to use this interactive tool, if you want to know this information, I will link it all in the description below as well as in the pinned comments so you have access to it and you can do research for yourself about your surrounding area as well as other areas that you might be interested in relocating to. But the Department of Health and Human Services says that if you want to be more resilient as a human being and you want to make your community more resilient by being better yourself, the things you can do is maintain connections to family, places of worship, or volunteer organizations, which are all good things except for when you're not allowed to do them due to mandates based on the crisis that is happening right now. Be informed and educated. Okay, probably a good idea. Engage in community preparedness activities, which I also advocate for, and you should definitely get involved with your emergency management team in your county to see if they offer any training or if there's any seminars you can attend or anything along those lines, because having that information highway is definitely going to be a good thing when it comes to the intel game. Create an evacuation and family reunification plan. So they're saying that these are things you should have ready to go, which we all can agree with, I'm sure. Have a 72-hour disaster kit set aside. Okay, another relatively average piece of advice, but definitely something we can agree on. And get training, including CPR and first aid. So at least they're aware of the things that we all talk about very often here in this community, and they also advocate for. Now, obviously, some of those things are difficult to do, but it's still a good way to understand that resiliency as a community means building community, networking, maintaining those relationships, and then doing what you can to provide service to your community when the time comes. So those are all things that are very important to remember. But the other thing that you have to keep in mind is that these risk factors are things that we can plan around based on an SHTF event, because it is true that if you're in an area with more of these risk factors, there's a good chance you're going to see more unrest and more desperation than in other areas with less of these risk factors. I would caveat that with saying that even though a metropolitan area might seem like it has less risk factors due to percentages, it still has more people with higher risk factors than the places like rural North Dakota, which might have a higher percentage of high risk factor people, but that percentage is based on 40,000 people instead of 1 million. So those are things to consider when using this tool, but I definitely suggest you check it out. Make sure you take a look at it and do your proper planning and understand your area as well as any other area that you might be bugging out to or planning on relocating to. And hopefully this information gave you something to consider when it comes to whether or not you're hardened for an SHTF event in your exact location. Because we know, based on business and everything else that people like to say over the years, in my opinion, location does actually matter, especially when it comes to preparedness. So, if you have anything else for me, magicprepper.com, and besides that, that's going to be it for Magic Prepper.